Good afternoon, evening, or morning to you, whenever and wherever you're watching, and welcome to my channel. Today is a bit of a special video, because I'm going to be talking about something very near and dear to me. Recently I've had nothing short of a nightmare, and the two videos I've released have been blocked worldwide. While this is far from ideal, and did leave me a bit down in the dumps, I've decided to bounce back in the best way possible, by making this mammoth video focusing on the franchise I love more than any other. Focusing on Alien, Aliens, Alien 3, and Alien Resurrection first of all. Then I'm going to leap over the Alien vs Predator stuff and get into Prometheus and finally Alien Covenant. It's going to be a long one, so if you're here for one of the films in particular, there will be timestamps below to let you jump around to your heart's content. Just as there will be timestamps for each film, there will also be a timestamp which will allow you to skip the plot summary section, which will take place at the beginning of each segment, just in case you need your memory jogged. A quick heads up that there will indeed be spoilers aplenty, so consider yourself adequately warned. So, without further ado, the Nostromo is a commercial ship belonging to the company known as Weyland-Yutani. Its crew comprises 7 members, including Ripley, this series' protagonist. The crew are in cryosleep, due to wake up when they reach Earth so that they can deliver an ore refinery picked up from the planet Thaddeus. They're essentially truckers in space, blue-collar workers just trying to scrape a living. Before they reach Earth, they are woken up prematurely by Mother, the ship's AI interface, in order to respond to a distress signal being transmitted from a distant planetoid. Investigating the signal, they find a crashed alien vessel, in which they find a skeleton belonging to a giant humanoid lifeform, which has a suspicious hole in its chest, with the damage suggesting that something has burst out from within. Exploring the ship further, they find thousands of eggs waiting to hatch on the ship's hull, and curiosity gets the better of Kane, which allows an alien creature to spring from one of the eggs and attach itself to his face. Returning to the ship with the creature still firmly in place, one of the crew violates safety procedures to allow the creature on board. After a while, the creature leaves Kane and dies, but it soon becomes apparent that before the end of its life cycle, it has impregnated Kane with an evil embryo, which emerges from his chest, killing him instantly. The crew search the ship and hunt the creature, but when they realise that it has evolved rapidly into a hostile and remarkably intelligent killing machine, they find that they are hopelessly outmatched and must desperately fight for survival as they are picked off one by one. So here we go. This film really needs no introduction. It's a classic in every sense, a masterpiece devised by the most talented and twisted minds in the business, causing nightmares for many who found themselves captured by the retro-futuristic setting containing within it evils unspeakable. Flashing on your screens now is a list of all of the main crew who helped to bring the movie to life in the production team. This will happen at the beginning of each movie's allotted time, so that I can get the names and formalities out there and get straight into the juicier content of the film. But massive props to all of these people who have brought us this piece of entertainment. As a kid, I was well aware of this movie's existence long before I maybe should have been. Regularly I would browse the DVD section at my local Tesco and pick out a new movie that I wanted, which my parents would very generously buy for me. I picked this out on several occasions, always side-eyeing it whenever I walked down the aisle. It's such a gripping tagline, and the poster art of the alien egg is just dripping with allure. But, of course, my parents were sensible enough to not entertain my morbid curiosity, and instead bought me things like Big Daddy and Mr. Deeds. But when I did get around to watching Alien, my god, what an experience. Possibly the longest 2 hours of my life, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I was utterly entranced, in fear and in love all at the same time. We find ourselves in the year 2122, and are treated to very long still shots of the Nostromo's interior as the ship drifts across the vast emptiness of space. This happens as our ears are being caressed by Jerry Goldsmith's romantic, inquisitive, and yet somewhat foreboding score. The camera crawls through the hallways and slowly scans each room, in a manner that is almost predatory, instantly letting you know what sort of a ride you're in for. Everything we see is dead still, and it's this stillness that initially gripped me as my eyes were firmly peeled, locked onto the screen as I looked for even the slightest movement of this alien I was anticipating so much. Thankfully, Ridley Scott's film is far smarter than that, and instead we have to endure an extremely suspenseful hour of character and world development until we get to see the alien in its true glory. And even then, we never get a good look at it. And H.R. Giger's nightmare's design is hidden well by Scott, who masterfully composes his shots in an invasive and claustrophobic manner, many of which were filmed with a handheld camera operated by the director himself, with the rest of the beautiful cinematography being carried out by Derek Van Lint. As said earlier, the crew comprises 7 members. Ellen Ripley is the ship's warrant officer, and our protagonist. She's very courageous and has strong survival instincts, which we see as she takes command of the increasingly stressful situation. Weaver captures the strong leadership qualities of her character convincingly, particularly when confronting Ash for disobeying her command, and when she loses her temper with Parker as she pulls the group together to devise a solution to defeat the alien. Weaver adds another dimension to her performance when she conveys genuine fear in the final act, as she finds herself face to face with the beast. She is easily the standout performer within the cast, and this strong display earned her a tasty pay increase in the sequel years later. Dallas is the captain of the Nostromo. He is courageous like Ripley, but is prone to lapses of judgment, such as when he brings the alien onto the ship despite knowing very well that this violates safety protocol. It is this decision that ultimately leads to the crew's downfall, as he meets his demise in a final courageous act where he attempts to trap the alien in the airlock for disposal. His relationship with Ripley is highly entertaining to watch. It's very clear to the viewers that Dallas finds their engagements exhausting and doesn't enjoy being challenged all that much. This often leads to half-hearted decision-making on his part, as he tries to maintain a copacetic environment by choosing the easiest option possible. Parker is the ship's chief engineer. He is motivated within the film by his desire for an improved share of the pay. He vehemently opposes going to the alien planet, but is quick to change his tune once he learns that his pay could be withheld should he not investigate the signal. Though this might make him seem fairly weak of mind, Parker is one of the most fearless and aggressive in hunting down the alien, and only meets his demise due to Lambert's clumsiness. Brett, the ship's technician, acts as the Laurel to Parker's Hardy, and is similarly only interested in financial matters. He is given little on-screen development, and is the first of the crew to be hunted by the alien in one of the film's most memorable moments. Navigational expert Lambert is similarly underdeveloped, and given little screen time. She seems to be the most cowardly of the crew, crumbling under the stress of the situation, and is reluctant to get her hands dirty in the film out of fear of meeting the alien. She represents the audience's emotional state when watching the events unfold, and meets her end due to her paranoia-induced clumsiness, taking Parker down with her. Ash is the science officer on board, and the newest member of the crew. He is a bit of a mystery to his co-workers, who question his actions throughout the movie, and for good reason. It turns out that Ash is actually a synthetic being, or an android, who is on board to carry out a secret mission to bring the alien lifeform back to Weyland-Yutani, to be studied and weaponized with the safety of the crew considered a secondary objective. I'll talk more about his character's arc later. Another warrant officer on board is Kane. He puts his life in jeopardy by volunteering to investigate the alien ship, and it's this curiosity that ultimately proves to be his downfall, as he gets up close and personal with the egg on the ship's hull, and becomes the creature's first victim, suffering the most horrific fate of all. His death scene is probably the most well known within the film, and there is an interesting story behind the scene. According to Scott, it was imperative in order for this scene to be successful that the cast be completely unaware of what was going to take place. According to Sigourney Weaver, the crew were led to believe that Kane was going to play a larger role in the movie, but were aware that the creature was going to emerge in some way. Distracted in the other room, the cast examined the facehugger, which was stuffed of foul-smelling sea creatures such as clams and oysters. Meanwhile, the production team was preparing the set for the chestburster scene, using a fake torso full of animal organs from a local butcher's, as well as plenty fake blood. John Hurt would lie underneath the table with only his head exposed, and the setup worked a treat, with the reactions to the hyper-violent birth you see on camera being 100% genuine, with only one take of the gory explosion required. This moment's success is partly the result of the exceptional pacing of the film, and is the payoff to 1 hour of slow but tense build-up and development. The exterior of the ship is filmed through the use of miniatures against a vast backdrop. These shots look fantastic despite the fact that Scott faced the pressure of a very limited budget. It would come as little surprise, I'm sure, to hear that he took great inspiration from George Lucas's miniature work on Star Wars when filming his own movie. Coming out in the 70s, much of the futuristic tech on display in the ship looks charmingly primitive when viewed today, but at the time, the digital displays and manual control knobs and switches resembled a very believable future. This retro tech look is instantly identifiable as belonging to this world, even to some who may not have seen the movie. The Nostromo ship was a real set, created by the production team for the crew to run around in, which drew more authentic performances from the actors due to the heightened sense of immersion they felt. This display of care and dedication is not exclusive by any means to the visuals within the film, but this area is a large contributor to this frighteningly realised setting. I particularly like the homely touches present, in the form of various trinkets and desk toys, which are just lovely inclusions to help the fantastical events feel grounded within their own reality. I also love the look of the ship's AI core. This room is void of those homely details, and completely engulfs the room's inhabitant in futuristic tech. Continuing on with the film's strong sets and practical effects, the alien planet is dark and cold, its terrain treacherous, and the deep and dense fog enhances the claustrophobic feeling already established within the movie. The alien and the facehugger creatures are the work of painter H.R. Giger. Here is some of the original concept art for the facehugger and the alien in its final form for your viewing displeasure.
Ew, gross.
Giger was actually detained by airport customs once because they were so horrified by his gross paintings, which they thought were in fact photographs due to how unsettlingly realistic they appeared. A theme to Giger's work in the franchise which really sticks out to me is the sexual and reproductive imagery within his art. This is very much deliberate, and this theme is worked into the story, which is most evident when we learn that the facehugger, once attached to its victim, forces its eggs into them, essentially mating with them and impregnating the host. As for the xenomorph, its head adopts an intentionally phallic look, though this is more pronounced in future installments to the franchise. But in this movie specifically, its tongue is unquestionably phallic, as it stiffly ejects from its mouth to deal a striking blow to its victims. These are vile concepts, but support the invasive horror elements of this movie, and indeed this setting. In fact, Scott and screenwriter Dan O'Bannon brought Giger on board largely for the sexual imagery in his book Necronomicon. Not only is Giger responsible for the creature design, but also for some of the sets. In fact, it is he who should be credited, or I guess held accountable, for the grotesque alien ship design. Its material is metallic but also strangely organic, as if the ship itself is a living entity, with its bumpy textures and exposed wires acting as the bones and veins respectively. This synthetic aesthetic is a crucial aspect of this film, and indeed the franchise as a whole, so I hope you like it. I certainly do. It's a horrific dystopian look into what technology could turn our world into should biologists get a little too creative or adventurous. The ship looks massive as the Nostromo crew explores it, but this is all a clever illusion. The small budget didn't allow for such a grand set, so Scott and Van Lint's children were placed in spacesuits and acted as the Nostromo crew, making the surroundings appear far larger than they were. I also really appreciate the decision to make the xenomorph this jet black colour, which allows it to blend into the shadows with relative ease. There are in fact a few instances where you're looking at the alien in the middle of your screen, but you don't register it because it blends with the ship's dark interior so effectively. My favourite example of this can be found in the director's cut, where the alien hangs above Brett before taking him out. As the audience are yet to see the alien's final form at this point, it would surely provide a striking image on rewatch as the alien shows its intelligence for the first time, toying with its prey. The eggs on the crashed ship look positively vile, and that sheep intestine filling to the egg is wretch-worthy to say the least. There's slime on the egg's exterior which drips upwards, which is a freaky image created by just flipping the egg upside down, hanging it from the ceiling and shooting it from underneath with the camera flipped. I also want to talk briefly about the sound design here, which is yet another area in which this film excels. The ungodly shriek of the creature as it leaps onto Kane is truly shrill, and having watched this movie at one of its 40th anniversary screenings a couple of years ago, I can tell you that it was petrifying to hear with the theatre sound system blasting out at you. The silence and suspense in the build up to the moment make the jump scare payoff all the more satisfying, as it feels honestly earned rather than cheaply hurled at us accompanied by a banging orchestral alarm. On that note, Jerry Goldsmith is responsible for the score to Alien, though he was upset that his work was bastardized by the production team in that much of his work was cut and replaced by some of his tracks from a completely separate movie, simply because the editing team thought that it fitted the situation better. The score of Alien is epic and romantic, and wanders dreamily. Goldsmith builds much of the score on top of what would come to be known as the Alien chord, which comprises stacked minor sevenths placed on top of one another to give off an otherworldly impression. Goldsmith himself has voiced his belief that the great unknown is a romantic concept at heart. Ridley Scott and Jerry Goldsmith clashed over these ideas, as Goldsmith refused to provide a traditional horror soundtrack, as I believe he thought that the horrors of the story would reveal themselves on screen well enough, without the score needing to foreshadow them. I personally think that this was an inspired choice, as the main theme in particular evokes an appropriate sense of discovery, which is missing in future installments of the series. I personally do still hear that subtle warning of what might lurk within the unknown in Goldsmith's score, so I wonder if he and Ridley Scott did come to some small compromise in this regard. Either way, I think the score is really strong here from one of Hollywood's most respected composers. As promised, I'd now like to return to Ash's character briefly. Of course, the alien is the main threat within this movie and the franchise as a whole, but there is a hidden nefarious evil behind this whole ordeal.
We've got to have money.
Ash represents the Weyland-Yutani Company, and this story exists in part as a commentary on corporate control and their abuse of that control. There are subtle hints at this twist long before the reveal. Firstly, the crew are reluctant to investigate the signal, but we learn from Ash that, should they neglect the opportunity, the company is within their rights to withhold the crew's payment. Ash clearly has a vested interest in this planet from the start. It is also he that nudges the team to explore the planet's surface on foot, almost as if he knew that there was a life form out there waiting to be found. Behind this suggestion is that looming threat that the crew will not receive their pay despite completing the job for which they were hired. Later, Ash just happens to forget basic safety procedure, as it is again he who sets the film's events in motion, as he allows the alien parasite onto the ship by opening the airlock against orders. Funny that he should forget something so important when he was able to recite the small print of the crew's contracts earlier on. When Kane lies in the medical bay, the crew are eager to remove the alien from his body, but Ash seems sadistically keen on allowing the creature to continue on its business. At first I thought that this was simply his scientific curiosity at play, but upon reflection it's clear that Ash wanted the creature to be left unharmed so that he could complete his mission of returning the alien lifeform safely, with the crew being expendable in the process. This subtle foreshadowing of Ash's true intentions comes to a head when Mother reveals the mission to Ripley, and she and Ash have a tense battle. Ripley finds out that Ash is an android after Ian Holmes' terrifying performance as he malfunctions. This twist is a strong one which is hinted at, though never obvious, throughout 75% of the movie. It goes without saying that no company or employer should hold the ability to put their employees' safety at risk for their own financial gain, but that is exactly what we see here. Now, whether this is a message on Scott's part pertaining to a dystopian future in which this abuse of power could take place, or if it's a commentary on employer abuse in the world as we know it today, I'm not entirely sure. But it's certainly a compelling aspect of the film which leaves a pit in the viewer's stomach as they realise that this horrific scenario may have been worsened deliberately by Weyland-Yutani. The addition of the alien's acidic blood was produced by O'Bannon as an answer to the question of why the crew couldn't just shoot it. If they were to do just that, then the acidic blood would surely eat straight through the ship's hull, causing catastrophic damage to the vessel. Boldly, O'Bannon proceeds to congratulate himself within his script for coming up with what Parker refers to as the ultimate defense mechanism. But this aspect of the alien also means that we have to endure chilling moments where the alien and our heroes come within touching distance, and we as an audience feel just as vulnerable as the Nostromo crew. Doubling as an opportunity to hide the actor within the costume, this framing is uncomfortably personal and invasive, and the drool flowing from the creature's jaws is enough to paralyze the audience in sheer helplessness. The creature is intelligent, but kills indiscriminately and savagely, purely because it exists to do so, and this is another avenue from which much of the effective horror is drawn. We see the alien dispatch of the crew with ease, leaving Ripley as the sole survivor, who comes to terms with the fact that the only way to deal with the alien is to blow the entire ship to hell, with herself floating away safely in the escape shuttle. These last 20 minutes are the film's climactic peak, as Ripley creeps around every corner of the ship, attempting to evade the alien as it stalks her every move. We've seen Ripley's competence and her steely determination aplenty by now, but here we get to see the full range of Sigourney Weaver's acting capabilities, as she is crippled by fear when face to face with the creature. This section was not only panic-inducing when I saw the movie in the theatre re-release, but the strobe effect is maybe a little too far in my opinion. It's probably my biggest issue with the film. Watching it's kind of like a leap of faith. If you don't know that you've got some sensitivity issues, you will by the end of this film. Thankfully I think I'm safe on that front, but who knows, maybe this has caused some attacks of that nature, because it's just so harsh and unnecessarily so in my opinion. But besides this detail, which is admittedly the result of my own personal issues, this movie is near perfection in every other way. In the director's cut, there is an exceptional addition in the form of a deleted scene where Ripley discovers the alien's nest as she tries to flee. As far as gruesome body horror goes, the sight of Brett after his body has decomposed over a period of several hours, rendering him a vegetable as he breaks down into a new alien egg to continue the creature's life cycle, is about as haunting as it gets. Dallas, having been there for a shorter amount of time, is still conscious and begs to be put out of his misery. It's a great inclusion, even if it will go on to be contradicted in the sequel, although, in the sequel's defense, this scene wasn't released publicly until after Aliens existed. When Ripley makes it to the escape shuttle and destroys not only Weyland-Yutani's prized asset, but also their company's property, this is a very satisfying conclusion to a 2-hour anxiety attack. At least that's what you think. As it turns out, the alien has snuck onto the escape pod with Ripley, and the game starts all over again. The nightmare just won't end. The only difference here is that the playground that the game is being played on is unfathomably small. With the creature in touching distance, she's thankfully able to open the shuttle doors and blast it into space, where no one can hear it scream. This whole final scene was a reshoot after Scott thought the original demise of the alien was not as satisfying as it could have been. I'm thankful it's here because after Ripley drops her guard and is at her most unsuspecting and vulnerable state, it paves the way for the feeling of pure dread to be instilled in the viewer as they see the creature emerge from the shadows for one final bout of nightmare fuel. Whew! What a movie. It's on my top 10 films of all time list, which you can find somewhere on the screen just now if you're interested, and is rightly held as one of the greatest stories that this genre has given us. Alien is perhaps the best display of less is more that I can think of, perfectly utilising minimalistic cinematography to capture the beautifully constructed world which is teeming with life and believable, iconic characters. There are still so many questions the audience is left with by the film's conclusion. It's this fear of the unknown that makes horror so effective, just like I pointed out in my breakdown of The Babadook. Given that this approach also saves a filmmaker money, it saddens me that we don't get to see this quality in most of the horror releases nowadays. After the release of Alien, the only worry I guess was that a sequel would inevitably come along to try and answer the questions left in the film, but that sequel would cheapen this masterpiece in the process. The film is, after all, the perfect science fiction horror movie, and there would surely be no way to top that. Right? After floating through space in cryosleep for 57 years, Ripley is rescued by scavengers and returns safely to Earth. She is summoned for debriefing by Weyland-Yutani, who consider her encounter with the alien to be fictitious, on the grounds that for several decades now, there has been a human colony on the alien planet that Ripley's crew visited in the first film. This colony has never reported encountering such a hostile life form, and so Weyland-Yutani demotes her from her station and admits her for psychiatric evaluation, dismissing her concerns for the colony's safety. But, wouldn't you know it, communication with the colony suddenly ceases, and the company crawls back to Ripley, the closest thing that they have to an expert on the alien threat. After being manipulated, Ripley reluctantly agrees to return to face her demons once more. She is told that the goal of their mission is to exterminate the alien, and that it is in no way at all to capture it and profit from it. After being promoted to lieutenant, Ripley is sent with a small band of Marines to investigate the colony base, where they find very few survivors. Instead, they encounter not just one xenomorph, but an entire hive, as Ripley once again finds herself in a fight for survival against all odds. So 6 years after the release of Alien, 20th Century Fox were keen to create that seemingly inevitable sequel. Within the directing ranks was an unknown to cinema at the time, in the form of a young man called James Cameron, who was preparing to shoot a little movie that you might have heard of called The Terminator. Cameron presented the studio with his pitch for Alien 2, but they weren't particularly thrilled with his outline, so they shelved the project for the time being. Later, when he was able to present a more detailed, though still incomplete screenplay for the movie, 20th Century Fox were suddenly back on board, but they had to wait for Cameron to complete his other project before pre-production could begin. Sigourney Weaver was hesitant to reprise her role, to put it lightly, but she too was thrilled by Cameron's screenplay, and in particular the maternal relationship Ripley develops in the story with young Newt. Her reprisal was by no means a cheap one, netting Weaver an astronomical pay increase from $35,000 to a cool $1 million. So, the initial screenplay was great, and the lead was on board, but the fear still persisted that the sequel would ultimately lessen the impact of Ridley Scott's masterpiece. Surely lightning couldn't strike twice. Cameron knew this all too well, and so he makes the decision here to step in a different direction with the series, and creates a sci-fi action epic, which develops on the themes of the original, but doesn't attempt to replicate its tone. And while some may hold Alien as the ultimate example of less is more working in full effect, others might point to Alien as proof that bigger can be better. As stated, Weaver reprises her role of Ripley, and her character is given more dimensions within Cameron's film. Here Ripley evolves from the headstrong but hopelessly outmatched survivor we saw in the first film into one of the greatest action heroes of all time, as she stands toe-to-toe with the xenomorphs by the film's conclusion. Newt is one of the colony's few survivors, and develops a close relationship with Ripley during the film. They each represent something that the other has lost, as Ripley seems to act as a mother figure for the young orphan. Michael Biehn joins Cameron yet again, following their work together on The Terminator. In Aliens, he plays Corporal Hicks, who comes into his own at the midway point of the movie as he assumes control of the mission following the death of the sergeant. Hicks and Ripley both employ a similarly pragmatic approach to their duties, and bond as a result of seeing eye to eye on how to take care of the alien hive. Hicks has a sensitive side too, though, which we see in some intimate moments between him and Ripley, and also when he becomes very protective of Newt, representing a father figure for her in this respect. Burke is the face of Weyland-Yutani in the movie, and is rather one-dimensional as a character, as he assumes Ash's role, in that he holds the company's financial interest above the safety of their employees, which we see when he allows the facehuggers to attack Ripley, as part of his plan to smuggle an alien embryo back to Earth. His selfishness ultimately leads to his downfall, as he traps himself in with the xenomorph whilst attempting to betray the Marines and leave them to die. Bishop is the obligatory android character within the movie, however is a superior model to Ash in that he is programmed to protect human life and see that no harm comes to crewmates above all else. His relationship with Ripley is very interesting, as he must win her trust over the course of the story, given her less than stellar history with synthetics. The first thing that you might notice is that the sets in Aliens are far larger and more elaborate than those of its predecessor, and the cast is significantly more vast, even if less interesting in my humble opinion. Of course this was always going to happen with the increased budget that Cameron received, but the difference isn't so large that you shouldn't marvel at what Cameron is able to achieve here. The dirty and cramped sets of the first movie are replaced by a far grander and cleaner viewing experience, which never attempts to re-establish Alien's invasive visual style. Cameron is very eager to tell his story. As a result of his consistently fast pacing here, there's a small feeling of disappointment that Ripley never sees the opportunity to reflect on the loss of her old friends and colleagues to the alien monster. Now, she may have undergone that period of grief off camera, but it would have been a very human and emotionally engaging sequence to witness on screen ourselves. We do get one emotional moment in the director's edition, in which Burke informs Ripley that her daughter, Amanda, passed away at the age of 66, 2 years before Ripley was rescued and while she was in cryosleep. Amanda last saw her mother as a 10-year-old child, and it's apparent that this news is very painful for Ripley within Weaver's performance. She now realises that not only has the xenomorph robbed her of her friends and colleagues, but also of the opportunity to experience motherhood, and to watch her daughter grow and live a happy life. I think this is a very clever addition from Cameron, as it adds an extra layer to Ripley's rivalry with the xenomorph moving forward, and makes their encounters more personal. So I think the addition is a positive one with great value. What perhaps has less value is the added scene where we see Newt's family out on a scavenge before being attacked by a facehugger. This only hurts the tension of the movie in my opinion, as there has been a mystery to that point as to what exactly has happened to the colony, even though we do know on some level. When Hudson detects the living colonists on his scanner and they're all huddled together in one section of the base, there is a question there, no matter how small, as to whether or not they are in fact hiding together. But in a horrific turn of events, it's revealed that they're in fact strung up on the walls in line to be hosts for breeding. This should have been a very effective moment, but our strong emotional response is robbed from us when the mystery is all but dispelled within the first 10 minutes by this additional scene. One thing that I do have to commend Cameron on though, is that he's able to capture the atmosphere of LV-426 pretty much perfectly. The fog parts to reveal the crashed ship, just as it did in the first film, and the planet feels similarly cold and dangerous and derelict. I can imagine Cameron drafting his screenplay and thinking to himself, well, what's more terrifying than an unstoppable creature coming to get you from any angle? Well, how about hundreds of them coming to get you from every angle? Turning the movie here into an action piece surrenders some of the suspense because these things get cut down like butter by the Marines. Part of what made them so scary to me was the thought that they were seemingly indestructible. Parker even marvels at their ultimate defense system in the form of its corrosive blood. But here, Marines are firing machine guns straight into the aliens' mouths and are only getting acid burns if the plot should allow it. And even then, they prove to be easily treatable this time round, whereas in Scott's original work, the acid was so potent that it could melt its way through several layers of metal. Cameron makes the aliens behave in that hive mind sort of way as well, and I think the xenomorph works better, personally, as a lone Terminator threat rather than as a glorified bug. This is a bit off topic, but I also think that this is why the Daleks lost a lot of their appeal in the later series of Doctor Who. Because one of them, which appears unstoppable and independent, is a far scarier concept than just throwing hundreds of them on the screen with as many of them being wiped out as possible. This is also probably why Cameron elects to have such a large cast in the movie, so that we can get to see these gruesome action scenes where their numbers on both sides are just being torn down in front of us. It's a spectacle to be sure and really makes for exhilarating action. Although I do take slight issue with the fact that the aliens seem almost keen to be put to the slaughter this time round, with presumably hundreds of them being reduced to pulp as they attempt to break through the Marines' defences, in an additional scene at the midway point. It's a dramatically strong scene for sure, but it crumbles when examined under scrutiny. After all, is it not the xenomorph's goal to grow as a species, and are they not supposed to be an intelligent species at that? Perhaps this line of thinking is why the scene was removed to the theatrical release of the film, but I can't deny that it is an entertaining scene above all else, which is probably why it was restored into future edits. The Marines are almost a blessing and a curse, because by having all of these guys in your movie to act as cannon fodder, it means that you can have those thrilling action set pieces, but it also means that you can't really give them all adequate development. In the locker room we meet Vasquez, who is a really enjoyable character to watch, but she's kinda one note.
Where they are.
She feels more like a carefully calculated toy idea than an actual human being. Her male squad mates are all sexist meatheads from what we can gather, with the exception of Hicks, who, even though he is developed more in the latter half of the story, can't get some much needed development in the first half because he has to share the screen with so many other characters. I think it's interesting that the Marines spent 2 weeks with the Special Forces in Britain to train for this movie, and it does reflect in their posture and strategic movements. The sergeant was a real American military sergeant and never had another acting role to my knowledge, so this adds a nice layer of authenticity. But he's one of the first to die, and I think I would have preferred to have him stick around a bit more. In Alien, the small cast have enough time to interact with each other, so you really care when the family starts to be torn apart. Ash is a great character with plenty of nuance in his development, and none of the cast in Aliens that I can think of share his depth. In Aliens, I personally was only invested in Ripley and Newt. Michael Biehn's likeable performance makes me care about Hicks for sure as the film progresses, but I can't help but feel that this is a case of too little too late. I think the most interesting of the Marine characters is Gorman, who is overwhelmed and incapable of carrying out his duties due to his inexperience, and whose moment of hesitation might have caused the death of more of his squad mates than was necessary. Hudson is a perfectly fine character, and from what I can gather is a fan favourite, and I do appreciate his comedic presence, which helps to lift the mood during all these catastrophic events. There are good characters here, absolutely. It wouldn't be a James Cameron film if there weren't. But there are so many that have nothing to them, and they exist for no greater purpose than to die, and, in turn, they rob the better characters amongst them of some valuable screen time. You might disagree with this assessment of the characters, and maybe you're a big fan of the bloodbath in the gunfights, because it does admittedly make for really effective action, and it helps this movie to stand out as one of the best of its genre. But for me, the tension is lessened in Aliens by the fact that I don't care much for these characters that are being killed. In fact, their cocky nature before meeting the alien almost makes me root for the xenomorphs to teach them a lesson after they're so disrespectful to Ripley and her experiences on the Sulaco. I'm not saying that I was happy to see them go, but I was kind of ambivalent. I really enjoy pretty much every action set piece in the movie, particularly the first one in the hive, and the one where the Marines are camped out in the science area and the aliens flank them from the ceiling. The reveal of the hive could be stronger without the random facehugger scene I spoke about earlier, but seeing the aliens unfurl from the roof when they're disturbed in the hive is a really unsettling moment. The Marines are completely surrounded and can't fire their bullets for fear of overloading the cooling station above them, so many of them at once just feels like it's going to be game over.
Game over, man!
Yeah, exactly. This scene is enhanced so much by James Horner's score, which is appropriately regimented and march-like in the action scenes, with its consistent snare drums mimicking our racing heartbeat in the face of such adversity. It's a strong score for sure, which accompanies the on-screen thrills perfectly. The main contribution to the world that Scott and O'Bannon devised is the introduction of the alien queen. The whole final 15% or so of the movie is fantastic, as Ripley and the queen go head-to-head in a battle of motherly instincts. Ripley looks to rescue Newt, but sees the opportunity to lay waste to the queen's lair as being too good to pass up. The queen desperately looks to protect her young and leaves the nest in pursuit of her revenge. The emulation of the finale from the first film might have been considered uninspired, were there not so many interesting variations to the formula which helps to keep this scene so fresh. True, both films end with Ripley thinking that she's safely escaped, only to find the alien has hitched a lift. But in Aliens we get one of the most satisfying action showdowns of all time, as Ripley operates the loader she displayed competence with earlier to finally get her own back on the creatures that have tormented her life so much. There's an emotional weight to this standoff, which I think both Scott and Cameron can be credited for in equal measure. I find the death, or I guess destruction of Bishop, to be an effective emotional beat too, as he has just earned Ripley's trust, only to be cruelly torn apart by the Queen. This moment looks stunning with all of his milky innards collapsing to the floor. Thankfully, he still manages to do his part though, in the final battle as he's able to save Newt from being ejected into space. After besting the bitch in a tense battle, Ripley has defied the odds yet again, and has managed to overcome her trauma. She escapes another life-threatening situation intact, and this time she has a happy family unit to share her victory with in the form of Hicks and Newt. Overall, I think this finale would have been a fine conclusion to Ripley's story, but as we know, that's not where this comes to an end. I'm sure we're all looking forward to seeing the mother-daughter relationship blossom wherever the franchise goes next. Similarly to Ripley, James Cameron truly defies the odds with his beloved sequel to a flawless film. He manages to create a film which pays faithful homage to the original and develops its mythos and themes. But, at the same time, he's able to provide a completely different viewing experience which excels for its own reasons, and introduces the new thematic focus which is going to endure for several of the following entries in the form of motherhood. His film also looks and sounds nothing short of magnificent, with his grand sets and futuristic technology appearing more impressive and timeless than is perhaps the case in Alien. The only exception to this that I can think of is the usage of some shaky blue screen technology at the midway point. This is further proof to just support the claim that Cameron can work wonders with a relatively small budget, in this case of under $19 million, which might sound like a lot to you, but when you watch Alien Resurrection like I did shortly after this, you come to realise that Cameron truly is a master of filmmaking. But we'll get to Resurrection. We'll get to that. Though I am not in this camp myself, I can certainly understand why many consider this film to be the peak of the Alien franchise. Whilst Alien is at times a slow burner, which places greater emphasis on its characters, Cameron drives Aliens forward from one thrilling action piece to the next at a breakneck pace, and never gives the blood a chance to stop pumping. Alien and Aliens are the two titans within this franchise that carry the weight of the lesser entries in the series on their shoulders by nature of their own stratospheric quality. But now that we've looked at the squeaky clean foundations, it's time to move on to something a little more complicated. Alien 3 has two notable edits. The 1992 theatrical cut is a diabolical nightmare and is the result of an ironically excessive abuse of executive control. The film is uneven, unfinished, and borderline unwatchable, and so, for my own sanity, I'm instead going to discuss the 2003 assembly cut, which is about a half hour longer and is a much superior experience, and it's one that I would highly urge those of you who haven't done so yet to check it out. After escaping with Newt and Hicks from the moon LV-426, a stowaway alien egg causes the Sulaco to eject its escape vessel, sending Ripley to crash land on Fiorina 161, on the shore of an all-male correctional facility home to extremely dangerous individuals who have converted to fundamentalist Christianity in pursuit of redemption. Unfortunately, although Newt and Hicks did not survive the crash, the alien hijacker does. The prison does not allow any weapons of any kind, and with help from the company being a long time away, the prisoners must simply survive in any way they can as the xenomorph picks them off. Ripley must survive both the dangers presented by such a hostile environment, as well as the xenomorph that she has brought to its front door. So the troubled production of this movie is very well documented. I think it's rather telling that director David Fincher has disowned the film given the turbulent nature of the experience, where he was given little creative agency on the project by the studio execs. It's a complex and long-winded story, but here's a brief summary. With 6 years having passed since the release of James Cameron's hit installment to the franchise, 20th Century Fox were eager to produce the much-anticipated third entry. Rennie Harlin was brought on board to direct, but clashed repeatedly with the studio and eventually got fed up with the constant changes to the story drafts and the screenplays. Having lost all interest in the project, Harlin instead moved on to direct Die Hard 2. Not a bad fallback gig. Next to sit in his chair was Vincent Ward, who jumped on board after his idea of having the movie be set on a wooden planet, full of monks looking to escape the technological evils of Earth, was supported enthusiastically by Fox. Excited to get the sequel out, the studio threw tens of millions of dollars at the project and announced a release date of 1992, giving Ward less than 2 years to finish his script and bring his vision to fruition. Obviously, he was unhappy with this public pressure, which was part and parcel with such an announcement, and the cracks in his relationship with the studio were starting to show. But Fox were fully committed towards gradually developing script, and so many sets for his wooden monk planet were being built. However, as they mulled over the movie's story a bit more, The studio began to doubt the premise itself and made heavy demands for changes, including the abandonment of the setting, insisting instead that the story take place on a mining facility, as the logistics of maintaining a wooden planet seemed too impractical to be realistic. Now, as you can imagine, Ward wasn't best pleased by this, and so Fox removed him from his post, and they had to look elsewhere. They found a younger and more impressionable individual in David Fincher, whose resume up to this point was somewhat limited to his direction of music videos for various high-profile performers, such as Madonna and George Michael. He leapt at the opportunity to direct the sequel, having been a huge fan of the original film. But I'm sure he now thinks of this franchise with little more than contempt, as he was dropped straight into the deep end with half-constructed sets, a half-finished script, and little more than a year and a half until the film's scheduled release date. He was also disrespected by some of the larger names on the set due to his perceived inexperience, and was truly given a baptism of fire into the world of film directing. With an extremely impressive filmography today, Fincher is notoriously a very careful and precise director, but couldn't exercise this precision here as he was rushed along by Fox, who weren't going to budge on the scheduled release date. It was all a bit of a nightmare, and by the time that filming in London had wrapped, the movie was still very much incomplete, and so extra shooting days were arranged in LA to finish Alien 3 in time for its opening date. This would prove to be an expensive choice, with the budget slowly creeping up to $50 million in the end, making it far and away the most expensive of this original trilogy. To help keep these costs as low as possible, the studio did not allow Fincher to shoot everything that was required, and so the result we got in the theatrical release is this surgically constructed Frankenstein's monster of an edit, with chunks being stitched together where they didn't belong, to try and create a more competent narrative. So it's fair to say that the odds were firmly stacked against Alien 3, and this was reflected by a lukewarm at best response from critics and audiences alike. The assembly cut would come along and fix many of these issues with extra footage and line recordings from the original cast, due to some of the terribly recorded segments which were borderline inaudible in the original release. Even with this extra ADR, which is at times painfully noticeable, there were still moments where I couldn't make out a word of what was being said for the life of me. It is an improvement though, and I would recommend that you avoid the theatrical version like the plague, because you're doing yourself a disservice, as the assembly cut is a pretty good movie. Now, admittedly, I would say that the final half is a real drop in terms of quality when viewed in contrast to the first, but I was actually quite shocked by how much I was invested in this film on rewatch. In fact, there are elements of Alien 3's assembly cut in particular which I consider to be superior to those of the original two movies. Specifically, I'm referring to the movie's thematic strength. I'll get into that shortly, but first I'd like to talk a bit about the characters. Ripley returns here, of course, and Weaver again gives a great performance, proving that she was worth every penny. She was adamant that this sequel should again see the characters defenceless against the xenomorph, because she thought that the gun-blasting action well had been pretty much drained by the previous installment, and only agreed to return if her character would be laid to rest by the end of this chapter. Here, Ripley is placed in the company of dangerous people who have no goodwill for her. She bites back and stands up to the convicts in a very admirable and ballsy manner, really showing how she's been hardened by the events of the franchise. She takes command of the situation as the prisoners warm up to her and soon defer to her expertise of surviving xenomorph encounters, as she desperately tries to keep the alien from falling into company hands so that it cannot be released onto Earth. Clemens is the chief medical officer and is a former inmate himself in the prison. He is a kind and cool individual with a tragic history which landed him in Fiorina 161. A gifted student with a bright future in medicine, Clemens became a morphine addict due to such pressure. One day, whilst intoxicated on his placement job, Clemens prescribed a heavy dose of painkillers to multiple people injured in a nearby explosion, and 11 of these 30 casualties died due to this overdose, landing him in prison. He's not a monster or a caricature, he's a realistic and interesting human character. He was a stupid kid who was extremely irresponsible and is haunted by his past, harbouring great guilt and remorse. He rescues Ripley, restoring her health, and then acts as a guide for her. The two form a connection and develop an intimate relationship, But this relationship is short-lived, as Clemens is brutally killed by the xenomorph as Ripley watches on in horror, having yet another person in her life ripped away from her. Harry Andrews is the prison warden, and is an absolutely delightful piece of work. He rules the compound with an iron fist, and is condescending to everyone around him, including Ripley. He refuses to trust her and is not concerned with her safety, as much as he's concerned with blaming her for leading the good prisoners astray with her supposed feminine wiles. His lack of respect for Ripley brings his demise as he ignores her warnings about the xenomorph which is loose in the facility, and he pays a heavy price for this.
Fuck!
Dylan is an inmate in the prison, but also acts as a reverend spiritual figure and leader for the prisoners. He is an ill-tempered and dangerous man with a propensity for violence, particularly against women, as he's very quick to point out to Ripley in their first meeting. He heroically sacrifices himself in the end so that Ripley and the inmates can defeat the alien and stop it from reaching Earth. Aaron, otherwise known as 85 in reference to his IQ, is a prison guard who spends his life being talked down to by Andrews. When the warden is killed, the burden of leadership falls onto his shoulders. He doesn't have the strength to bear this, and so the buck is passed to Dylan and Ripley. He is a family man and does care for the prisoners. This is shown when he is greatly saddened by the death of prisoner Murphy on his watch. Since this is the first alien kill in the movie, it's presumed that Murphy fell into the hazardous surroundings of an area that Aaron sent him to work in. Aaron is present when Ripley discovers that she has been impregnated with an alien queen, and is generally friendly to her unlike his boss, but the two butt heads, and he ultimately assists the company in coming to capture the loose alien and Ripley's queen. When he realises that Weyland-Yutani care more for their potential bioweapon than they do their employees' well-being, Aaron attempts to stop them in their tracks, but is shot and killed in the process. Golic is a dangerous and deranged inmate who worships and idolises the xenomorph. I also thought his character had some sort of DID, as he adopts multiple accents and personalities in the film, but no, it turns out that this was yet another example of how messy this film's production was. Paul McGann had a vision for his character to behave somewhat like Charles Manson, but Fincher fought heavily against this. But Fincher forgot to reshoot these scenes, or wasn't allowed to reshoot these scenes, and so that left us with this confusing result in which both accents feature in equal measure in the film. Golic dies by breaking the alien out of its imprisonment at the midway point, as he wants to get a closer look at his idol. Morse is one of many inmates who have decent supporting roles, but couldn't necessarily be considered as part of the main cast. But I've included him here because he's probably the most entertaining character amongst them. He has a certain cheeky quality, and seems to be well liked in the prison, but is a slimy and unagreeable person too, who blames Ripley for the xenomorph's arrival to the planet. But he's a faithful servant to the cause and sticks with her, becoming the only survivor in the prison by the end of the story. The events of this movie's controversial opening sequence are to this day a point of great contention due to the deaths of Hicks and Newt, fan favourites from Aliens who appear only as corpses in this sequel. This choice was an insulting one in the eyes of many Aliens fans, as the ending of that film had given Ripley a slither of hope and happiness in the form of her new companions. The film was marketed initially as though it were going to be set on Earth, and many going into it would have been looking forward to seeing the family dynamic between the group develop further. But at the end of the day, this franchise doesn't exist to make its viewers happy, and so Alien 3 tears this comfort from us in its first moments, dragging us once again into the pit of despair to which we have become well accustomed by now. Ripley's life has been haunted by this evil force, and once again she's given a reminder of why she hates her adversaries so much. Nobody is safe in the franchise. No matter how much we might love any particular character, they're still vulnerable and fair game in the eyes of the cold and uncompromising xenomorphs. In that regard, I'd say that the unhappy response to the opening, if anything, proves its success in taking the series back to its original bleak tone, and away from the enjoyable action romp feel of James Cameron's movie. Though I have defended this opening from a storytelling standpoint, I can't quite find myself excusing the convenience of the alien eggs on board the Sulaco. The Queen in the previous film clutched to the sides of Ripley's shuttle before the final confrontation, and simply couldn't have laid her eggs on board in the time that she was off screen. And that's with me assuming that she's capable of laying eggs at all without the egg sac that she left behind in the nest on LV-426. It just doesn't make much sense to me, and the only possible explanation in my eyes is that the writers were lost for ideas of how to have Ripley encounter her nemesis again. I said earlier that I consider Alien 3 to be the most thematically interesting of the original trilogy. The movie takes some of the strongest themes of the two, namely the themes of classism, motherhood, and feminism, and expands on these greatly, whilst also including a religious element to the story. The score, composed by Elliot Goldenthal, plays on this religious theme, featuring various choral chants and religious tracks, including a haunting Agnus Dei, as the inmates mourn the loss of their brothers whilst trapping the xenomorph in the toxic waste disposal chamber. I think that the score as a whole is perhaps the least memorable of the series to this point, and it's perhaps the most derivative too, but the climactic track as well as the aforementioned religious pieces make for an interesting addition to the franchise which explores a sound world that hadn't been done yet in the series. Feminism within this franchise was always present. Video essays and articles can be found all over the internet confirming and exploring as much. The original film acts as a horrific dystopian abortion parable, stripping hosts of all agency as their body is violated and turned into a mere vessel for a baby that isn't their own. Without the means to remove the embryo, the victim is forced to forfeit their life so that the child can be born. The support for the availability of birth control, or perhaps it's better to say, the warning of what a world would be like without birth control, was a very progressive stance for Ridley Scott to take. But the message is clear within the subtext of the on-screen events, even if it's never outright stated or made obvious. The second movie celebrates motherhood and also deals with female representation within the military and challenges gender roles, with the formerly dubbed comically sexist meatheads teasing and singling out Vasquez for her tomboyish qualities. The most blatant example of feminism is perhaps the female objectification and sexual assault being laid bare in front of her eyes in a painfully uncomfortable scene where Ripley is cornered and sexually assaulted by a group of prisoners and made to feel as though she doesn't belong within the all-male group. Ripley is vilified by the warden for distracting the convicts by nature of her sheer existence, and is blamed also for causing the brothers to have indecent thoughts. The theme of motherhood continues rather bleakly in a manner that's fitting for Alien 3's depressing tone. There's a cruel irony to the fact that Ripley had been robbed of her chance of motherhood in Aliens, and yet here she finds herself cursed by it. It's as if the alien queen had the last laugh by giving Ripley exactly what she wanted. It's a clever decision by the writers to take the monster, which Ripley has always fought on an external level, and force her here to fight it on an internal level, as the evil becomes a part of her. It's probably been her greatest fear since her first encounter with the xenomorph. In fact, we saw her struggle in Aliens with many restless nights in which she envisioned this exact nightmare scenario. And so it was the logical conclusion to her character's arc to have her face and conquer her demons in this regard. It's handled very well in my personal opinion. I think that Weaver's performance in the X-ray scene in the EV is pitch perfect. She can't bring herself to look at the screen, and even though she probably already knows the outcome, it's still a hard-hitting and powerful reaction from her as she realises that this creature, which has been a part of her life for so long, has won in the end, and there's no way to fight it this time. It's a far cry from the optimistic fight for survival in Aliens, and I know that the utter despair of the movie from here on out, as there's almost a timer counting down on the aliens' victory, left a sour taste in many people's mouths. Something a bit cheerier to discuss now. I think that Charles Dance is brilliant as Clemens, and he plays off Sigourney Weaver really well. The two have a good chemistry, and watching them warm up to each other is probably the least glum thing that this whole journey has to offer. And the tiny shred of realistic romance, if you can even call their hookup remotely romantic, helps to provide some much needed emotional variety given all of the dreary darkness surrounding it. For me, the film's greatest crime, in both the theatrical and the assembly edits, is that one scene, which is quite chilling aside, it almost entirely removes any fear factor from the xenomorph, which we see running around awkwardly in a mix of puppetry and special effects. The reason this fear factor is essentially nullified here is because we see the thing's full body in brightly lit environments, removing any mystery and showing up the noticeable shortcomings of the blue screen technology that Fincher and his team were wrestling with. The only unsettling moment involving the creature is this famous shot right here of the alien bearing down on Ripley before it realises she's carrying the Queen inside of her, and so it scampers off. You might notice that the alien looks tiny compared to the usual xenomorph we've seen before, and that's because this is the first time that we get to see the alien adopt a form that isn't human. The xenomorph adopts physical traits of its parent host, so in this case the xenomorph takes the form of an ox. Wait, a dog? So what happened here is the theatrical cut had a prison dog in it called Spike, which was impregnated by a facehugger from Ripley's ship and became a host. But for a reason that I cannot fathom, it was later decided for the assembly cut that the host creature would be changed to an ox. Yet the alien's design didn't change with this decision, so we still bizarrely see a little dog running around, which doesn't share any traits with an ox besides being a quadruped. I guess the change might have been because people aren't usually fond of seeing domestic animals like dogs or cats being captured in gruesome pain as we see here. But this film was already depressing enough, so why even make the change at all? In the 92 version, the theatrical cut, this dog is shown on screen and addressed as Spike, which means that when Murphy calls to it in the shaft later, but is instead greeted by the alien, it's a much more effective scare than in the assembly cut, where Murphy still calls asking for Spike even though there's no such dog in this version, which is just completely confusing to the audience who don't have a clue what he's on about. But you'll find that this isn't the only laughable inconsistency with the alien in this movie. In some scenes we see POV shots from the alien's perspective, or we even see shots of the alien tower above its victims like the old xenomorph form would. But then in other scenes we see this tiny stop-motion puppet. I tried to pretend in my head that there were actually two aliens running around the facility, and that makes it a bit easier for me to watch, but there are still moments where it changes from a guy in a suit to a puppet in the same sequence, which just drives me insane and takes me out of the experience. We've seen everything that the xenomorph could really offer us at this point as a horror monster, and it's a bit disappointing that the only thing that Alien 3 can bring to the table is a smaller, more agile, but still less intimidating body. It's unfortunate, but the alien is the worst part of this film in my opinion. The dramatic elements work for me, but the horror really lets the film down. I think the first hour of the film is really strong, and doesn't look out of place alongside the greats that came before it. But as soon as Clemens and the warden are killed, the movie's quality takes an absolute dive off a cliff. It's almost as if killing your two most interesting characters before the halfway point is a terrible move. I get it though, it's again trying to show the audience that nobody is safe from the alien's indiscriminate killing sprees, but the film certainly suffers from losing Charles Dance's personality. Even though the alien might be the worst part of this movie, I should commend Fincher and his team for making the decision to have the final confrontation be with an adversary that isn't the alien itself, in this case, the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. Finally, Ripley has a face for her enemy, and it's Bishop? So Lance Henriksen shows up and tells Ripley that he's not an android, but is instead the human that the android was created in the image of. He was sent to provide Ripley with a friendly face to try and manipulate her into coming with him, so that they can remove the Queen from her body. Ripley knows fine well that they cannot be trusted, and so she refuses his offer, which causes the company to become hostile. But she stands strong and realises that the only way to keep the xenomorphs out of Weyland-Yutani hands is to sacrifice herself into the pit below, taking the child within her down too, and finally getting closure and ridding her life of the evil once and for all. I find this scene to be quite an emotional one, and it's certainly helped by the epic score accompanying Ripley's heroic final act. I think that all three films did a great job in bringing Ripley's story to a close, which is an impressive feat for sure, in that all three managed to stick the landing and not detract from the others. I do find it funny though, that Henriksen's performance is more robotic here than it ever was when he was playing the actual android. Now this might have been by design to prolong the mystery of whether or not he was lying to Ripley, or it might just be that he didn't care much for the material he was given. In fact, I think that the whole cast seemed to be hamming it up in this last section. Most of the delivery was pretty stellar all round, up until this scene, where I was holding back laughter at some of the line reading when I rewatched it.
achieve. Stop! It's the chance of a lifetime! You must let me have it. It's a magnificent specimen. Oh, jeez. No pictures!
I will say I think this movie is quite visually unappealing. Fincher was trying to recapture the lived-in, industrious look of Ridley Scott's film, but the ugly browns and oranges which are present throughout make the film quite a chore to sit through, particularly in the latter half where the environments don't change very often, and there's not much to write home about in terms of the shot composition or framing as the film progresses. There are a couple of neat sets. I like the one where all of the prisoners come together to have meetings. It's framed in an almost traditionally theatrical way. It's almost like we're an audience watching events on stage on this elaborate set. But for the most part, it's just not a visually stimulating movie, which is something that Scott was capable of in spades. Now, obviously I should stress that Fincher is a wonderful director who is capable of creating really gorgeous films, and I don't place any blame on him here given the circumstances he was subjected to on this project. I do appreciate the decision to scale the story back a bit and focus on an isolated location with a lone Terminator threat once again. I like the fact that the creature yet again feels unstoppable due to the lack of weaponry in the prison, and it's nice that it's defeated in a different way than just shooting out of an airlock into space. But ultimately this creature's demise is kind of underwhelming, and you wonder if its presence was even necessary. It was most likely to get bums in seats, don't get me wrong, but I wouldn't be surprised if Fincher wanted to create a stylized drama where the only threats were the prisoners and the company coming to get the Queen in Ripley's body, but that he was forced to shoehorn some scary monster in there just to appease some old out-of-touch people in a boardroom. I feel like I've been throwing random talking points up in this segment with little structure combining it all together, and it's kind of because, in my defence, the movie's a bit of a mixed bag and it's a bit jumbled in itself. I do like the movie, I do, but it does feel like two films to me. One is an effective dark dramatic piece which harkens back to the slow, character-rich original. It doesn't reach the same heights of that film, but maybe if Fincher had been left to his own devices, it could have come a bit closer to that quality. The second half is a dull attempt to recreate the excitement of Aliens without any of the clever dialogue or the suspenseful action set pieces, or even the unique creative environments. Despite being the most expensive release in the franchise to this point, it somehow finds a way to look the cheapest, and the dodgy special effects certainly don't do it any favours in this regard. The truth is that this movie will speak to everybody a little differently. I've seen some people say that Alien 3 is their second favourite of the series, above Aliens due to its bleak atmosphere and its return to the isolated and more hopeless tone, whereas others point to this as a large reason as to why it should be considered weaker than its predecessor. The bleak tone is typified by the fact that Ripley's unfortunate fate is clear from the midway point of the movie. We know as soon as we learn that she is host to the Alien Queen that her doom is ultimately just a matter of time, and I can understand why this depressing inevitability and impossibility of victory is enough to turn many off. I do feel though that this chapter of the story doesn't botch the send-off for Ripley's character, and so works as an adequate end to her story. And so I can enjoy and appreciate it for the value it has as part of the overall narrative. Let me know what you think of Alien 3, because as I said earlier, it's a complicated one, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on the matter. If nothing else, I guess it's a miracle that the assembly cut turned out even half as good as it did, all things considered.